is my audience. Everyone's above 18.
Well,
Okay. My name is Nicholas Robert Gallo. Today I'll be doing my informative speech for Communication 100 for the University of Maryland University College. Today I'd like to be talking to you about the topic of what caused the Civil War. Before I get into that, I would like to preference the main topic with something called, or a definition of confirmation bias, which is the tendency to search for or accept only certain facts if it confirms your preconceived belief. And I see a lot of that happening in our society today when it comes to certain historical events, and it's a scary thing. And I see it being used to further certain political ideologies, and it's dangerous. It's a dangerous thing to happen. So one of the things that I see that used a lot with is the Civil War, and that's what I want to talk about. Just what led up to the Civil War. Starting from the foundation of our country, there was a division between the North and the South as to their position on slavery. A lot of the Northern founding fathers hated the idea of slavery and were very much against it, while the South at that time and before the Declaration of Independence relied on slavery for its economic expansion and well-being. When the Declaration of Independence was being drafted, certain founding fathers wanted to have slavery included in the actual Declaration itself, but knew that they had it in there, that the Southern states, and actually the Southern states were outspoken about it, refused to sign the Declaration of Independence. Founding fathers knew that they needed all 12 colonies, 13, to be able to effectively fight the British overlords, and they didn't want to be divided. So at the last moment, the last draft, they removed any mention of slavery, which was included by Thomas Jefferson, who ironically owned slaves. Moving further in history, in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was completed. James Madison purchased everything from the Mississippi everything from the Appalachian Mountains out to the Mississippi from Napoleon Bonaparte, so he could that would help him continue his war against the British Empire and the rest of Europe. That led to a problem, though, as the North and South were divided over the subject of slavery. They were debating on whether or not they would allow the new states that would form in those regions to allow slavery or not. So, in 1820, something called the Missouri Compromise was done by our government. Basically, what was happening was the state of Missouri was applying for statehood, but they were, at the time, a pro-slavery state. Now, if they became a state, that would unbalance the balance of factions within Congress. There was an even split between pro-slavery and anti-slavery. So there was a huge debate in the United States at that time about what they were going to do, and there was bitter debate over whether or not they were going to allow Missouri to even become a state because of that. They didn't want the pro-slavery faction to become too strong. So what happened was, at that time, Maine happened to be applying for statehood as well, and Maine, being a northern state, was very anti-slavery, so they decided to do what was called the compromise, where Missouri would be allowed to gain statehood and be pro-slavery, while Maine was granted statehood then, being anti-slavery, or what they considered free state at the time. In 1831 is notably one of the first and worst rebellions in the United States, in the southern states. Nate Turner was a slave, and he, along with a large group of slaves, rose up against their masters on the plantations they worked, and approximately 60 slave owners and their family members were slaughtered. It was a big deal because this was the first time blood was actually being shed over the issue of slavery in the United States. Eventually, the Southern militias were able to overcome the rebellion and put a stop to it, and Nate Turner and his followers were brutally murdered. In 1850, there was the issue of slavery was again tabled. I'm sorry, not tabled, but brought to the forefront because of the continued expansion of the United States. This was on the heels of the Mexican-American Civil War, in which new territory had been acquired from Texas all the way out to Southern California from the Mexican government. They didn't know how to deal with these new states because during the Missouri Compromise there had been a line drawn above Texas and below I think North Carolina that said anything below this can continue to be a slave state, while anything north of it that would be established would be considered a free state. So now all this land opened up, and they were starting to fight over whether or not these newly formed states, would become slave or free. So what happened was, by a slim margin, the Missouri Compromise was overturned, and they allowed basically the owner of the land to determine whether or not the person could or could not own slaves. So you can imagine the cascading negative effects that this would have upon the country, which led to what's called the 1854 to 1861 Bleeding Kansas War. It was also known as the Mini Civil War, where within that state there was many skirmishes over the issue of slavery, since everyone was free to decide whether or not they were going to own somebody or not. There was a lot of fighting there. This led to continued bloodshed over the subject of slavery. And for the sake of not running out of time here, I'll skip ahead to John Brown's raid, which happened in 1859. John Brown, being an abolitionist at the time, led a group of whites and freed slaves down to Harper's Ferry from Pennsylvania and captured Harper's Ferry arsenal with the intention of distributing weapons out to slaves in the South and inciting rebellion. Coincidentally, the army that stopped him from doing this was led by one Robert E. Lee, colonel at the time. He was charged with treason and then executed thereafter. And then finally in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was probably what most would consider the nail in the coffin, the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, over the issue. He was elected in a landslide in all northern states, while he was not even on the ballot in most southern states. He ran on the platform of abolition, freeing slaves, as most northerners were flocked to him and loved the idea because it was very popular at the time, thanks to certain books that had come out, like Uncle Tom's Cabin and other events that had happened. Not even a month after Abraham Lincoln was elected, the first southern state seceded from the Union, and that was South Carolina. And then after that, 6 other states seceded 6 months after that. At that point, war broke out with the bombardment of Fort Sumter and other bases in the South, as southern states attempted to basically solidify their independence and autonomy. So these are the events that led up to the Civil War. As they stand, I've tried to be as objective as possible and not get into a persuasive speech on this subject. In conclusion, you can see that slavery has been on the forefront of the American mind from the foundation, probably even before, up until the actual war itself. And that was my intention of describing slavery's role in the instigation of the war, and that thus concludes my informative speech on what caused the Civil War. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
Can we clap?
Yay!